To actually build guided buying requires not only do you understand the goal and the context of what the user is trying to do, right, which is agentic, right? You need that kind of piece of it, but that all the data underneath, there needs to be a data model, right, around the category, the data elements for that category, the process channel, the catalogs, the supplier type, all this like rich set of information that needs to be kind of assembled and create the workflows and the user experience and the data that's needed. Like in supplier onboarding is a great example, right? Like all these various permutations we're going to ask suppliers to only give us what we truly need versus here's your 400 questions you need to fill out, whether you're a truly critical supplier or just someone like me giving you an advisory service and here's some information on my website. I don't need to be SOC 2 friggin' certified, guys.
Joining another edition of The Never-Ending Climb for Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. Today, I have the great pleasure of being joined by an OG of our industry, Pierre Mitchell. Now, Pierre has been around and remembers everything from punch cards to LLMs and everything in between, and he can describe how all of those things have helped procurement, supply chain, and how they all work, which is really incredible. Pierre, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, I'm very happy to be here. And I don't think I really used punch cards too much. I did work in a data center, but I have programmed in some of the AI tools and Lisp and something like that from the late 80s. So yes, I date back to the Jurassic period in the last millennium. So I've seen some stuff, but happy to be here. So.
I think this is the important part, though, Pierre, is there are so many kids today that don't actually understand what it is they're using or how it works, but they can make it work. And when you understand what's underneath, you can get back to that first principle sense of what really matters, regardless of that next layer of technology, because there's certain principles that continue to be true. I think about where, procurement leaders and finance leaders, they often have a little bit of oh, here I am. But how did we get here? If you can just briefly run us through like ERPs, how those evolved into some of the add-ons for procurement and those extra suites that get layered on, and then what's that moving into today?
Right. Well, gosh, do that in like 3 minutes or less. Yeah. No, I mean, I come from a supply chain background, right? So back in my day, it was, MRP and then became MRP2, which then, you added all the white collar work and finance, and then that became ERP. But basically, I mean, the general idea was you just added more functionality, more business process, and it all got glommed into the Death Star and, into the Borg, basically into a giant monolithic application, right? And so even though you can sell parts of the monolith as little products, that is kind of what a traditional suite is, where what's sweet about it is that it's a single data model, a single application with a single vendor, one throat to choke, right? And that was kind of the happy path. And then unfortunately, it became a multi-vendor world. And as those who created the monoliths could not respond to the market quickly enough, that's when you started getting, more best-of-breed vendors. And so just even back in the dot-com era with reverse auctions or e-procurement solutions that were not using a traditional item master, so you start to sprout up all of these various, best-of-breed players that have a little bit deeper data model, better user experience, more time to value, and companies could use them to get very quick time to value, not have to wait for the monolith vendor to say, oh, I have it on my roadmap. Once it gets big enough and they freeze the market and say it's going to be out next quarter, and then, the quarter after that, and they never hit their dates. And then, that whole process. And then it's loosening the football. And we do that over and over and over for, 20, 25 years. So the movement from ERPs to, suites, they're both the same kind of concept. So when I call like the S2P suites, like mini ERPs for source to pay, none of the vendors like that, it's like, no, we're not that, but yet it's the same idea of it's all in one place. It's a single application, except for the vendors that grew from acquisitions, in which there's just kind of like the Franken suites, if, as I call them, right? You buy the different pieces, you kind of put some duct tape around it, you integrate a little layer on top, whether it's a workflow layer, some master data integration, and suddenly it's a suite, right? So the problem, though, is philosophically independent of procurement and our spaces. It's an application-centric approach. We just throw apps at the problem, smaller and better and deeper apps, but it's like that scene from Monty Python and the castles. We build another one and it sank into the swamp, and we build another one and it sank into the swamp, right? And the technology keeps changing, right? And we just keep throwing more apps, and the problem is now we're fragmenting all of these apps with physical data models over. Now we have, 39 vendor masters, which we now have to throw a vendor master, MDM solution to integrate all of that. And then the analytics solution on top of that. And you proliferate more and more kind of proprietary apps that all
You got
have
these little castle spires sticking up out of the data
castles
swamp
everywhere, and it's like I want to visit all the castles, but it's like Game of Thrones. No, sorry, we're like captive to the castle.
Then people are mining down into the swamp trying to figure out what the real vendor master is, and there's dragons down there.
Well, that's true. There be dragons and some of that old code. Those AS4. I just got off a call with an AS400 a client that had a lot of AS400 systems, and you never kill AS400s. They're always there, kind of running in the background, but anyway, that is, and then out with obviously with agentic and what's happening there and the LLMs, that's a whole kind of special snowflake in its own right, which is kind of fundamentally impacting all the architectures of modern SaaS apps as well as bringing new power to bear. But anyway, we'll hold off maybe on that piece of it. But I mean, I've been a tech analyst for 25 years in the procurement space. After I got out of supply chain, somehow fell into procurement. It's still been kind of this, feature function war, right? And kind of just building new functionality. And unfortunately, that's only been manifested by throwing more apps at the problem.
This is part of where in that giant Monty Python world that unfortunately that Inquisition finally did happen. And we end up with this castle in the middle, the big one, that ERP system. Right? That Death Star, if you will. That's the most important part, because that's where the CFO looks to go and make sure that the financials are actually correct. And so don't mess with that one. We've got to reinforce it, make it stronger. And now there's this giant debris field around it of all of these other things that kind of like Oracle, quite a few years ago, went on this buying spree and then had to create this fusion middleware to go weave it all together and then try to pretend that it was one big thing. There's these other organizations, and we don't need to name them because it's a lot of them, that have gone on the buying spree of buying things that then this composable ERP world, which sounds great in principle, except it's the ultimate square peg in the round hole problem, and it just doesn't fit. And then you end up, instead of composing things nicely, you end up with the Franken Who suite of the things that don't work and play together, and this vendor master is structured differently than that vendor master, and now they don't fit. Now people are arguing over and wondering why that vendor got away with whatever it was, because the analytics didn't show up with that behavior because it looked different and they thought it was a different one. So that Death Star in the middle, that ERP, whether you've picked the Oracle ERP or the SAP ERP, that's kind of the fundamental, that's the center of gravity in so much of these decisions, isn't it?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's unpack something, right? So, I mean, there's the piece around we need a solid data model, foundational model that basically models the world around us, digital twins. It models the commercial artifacts that we need, like contracts, right? The ultimate B2B system of record, the general ledger of which contracts should be driving that, and the GL. Yeah, absolutely. It is the system of record for closing the books. But there are a lot of systems that need to kind of hold key data that processes are wrapped around, and they need to be. And when we do like our solution map, our magic quadrant on steroids, if you will, we look at the breadth of the data models, we look at the depth of the data models, and then we looked at the functionality, right? How well the vendor can, deliver time to value in the certain space. But all the applications need to be good citizens in this new world, which is componentizing and making things composable is a great design goal since the beginning of systems architectures, right? You want to have lots of little components, micro apps, things like that. And they have to be open. They need to be transparent. There should be APIs around them. But they are complicated when you try to start plugging them and integrating them to other things, especially when those who are designing those Legos don't want those to fit with the other Lego version that's out there. And you're seeing this in the agentic space, right? Around a lot of the protocols that are happening there. So the design objective around having standardization and modularization and these things is absolutely key and something that you don't really see with a lot of the mega, ERPs that are out there. Let's just say it's a work in progress. As you know, some of these big systems, the devil is in the details down in the mines around where that data is stored. And there's just quite often, there's not an API for that, right? And it's not easy to integrate to. But for any of the newer vendors that live within, every vendor needs to live within a multi-vendor and a multi-technology ecosystem. And that ability, and we did this in our orchestration study last year, we saw, like one of the biggest differentiators around those who saw value and those who didn't was really deep integration and that ability to actually integrate to the systems that, the core systems, whether it's the ERPs and the suites and, whatever, and also outside of procurement, even into, the contract management systems or whatever it is, right? That integration really matters because at the end of the day, that's the friction, the data friction that's going to slow up the business process. So,
Yeah.
and that's kind of the issue with a lot of the agentic tools that are out there right now. It's like lampreys onto the shark. They're great. And you can kind of, harness all the sharks, but you need to actually be the shark and have some of the data model underneath it to persist that data so that you can integrate it with all those narrower apps underneath with those kind of, proprietary data models and such. So that's one of the challenges.
Absolutely. And if it's not done well, you'll have a whole bunch of folks sitting around singing Baby Shark doo-doo-doo-doo, and wishing that they had something that worked. I think that gets to the I in the T, right? In IT, there's so much focus, as you were talking about, in the technology, in the infrastructure, in the did we get the chips and the memory that we needed, and then the workflow. But the information is underweighted, I think. And this is one of the things that it is hard, but it is critical. And out of that first principle part, we keep talking about how you can't do anything without good, clean data. Well, okay, nobody has good, clean data, so we're not going to let the perfect stand in the way of the good. There's lots of things that we can do and should do on a journey. But yeah, trying to jump in with, both feet into the swimming pool, you'll quickly find out it is just that swamp. And there'd be dragons down there. But that I in the T in IT, talk us through that source of truth, why that matters so much, the square peg round hole.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, so I think it's funny, everybody somehow come to this realization that data is important when, applications, they are, and humans are prosumers of data. We produce it and we consume it, and we also need to store it and to model it and store it, right? And so it's always been half of the equation, whether you're an old IT person where you had kind of the whole world of, process and data flow diagrams and process diagrams. And then on the other side, you had entity relationship diagrams and modeling the core data. That's absolutely, the data is half the story. And actually it's most of the story, because at the end of the day, it is all data. It gets back to data and data models and ones and zeros, right? And all that. The piece around, data, dirty data and the data problem, I find that it's actually a very narrow discussion because it's usually about we have crappy data that we're putting into our P2P systems in a bad commodity code because we pick the drop down. That's the first one there. The end user has no clue what that field means. And, we'll just pick nuclear materials, as our first, commodity code. And it all flows through up, to our spend analytics. And you're like, gosh, I didn't realize we spend so much money on nuclear material. So anyway, you get into this problem. I know, it's so weird. But you get into this problem of just kind of, the data in these limited, narrow, data models within our classic SaaS apps is not good. And that's true. We need to fix the data problem around vendor masters, supplier masters, the parent-child relationship, the clean data governance, who owns it, how it immediately gets stale. Yes, absolutely. Need to solve it. Agentic is actually a very powerful tool to help us in automating a lot of these things when data changes and how do we propagate it. The data pipelines as we create analytics, that's all goodness, right? The agentic AI is really helpful in reducing the technical debt of this problem of keeping all these existing systems synchronized, right? That's a good thing.
Yeah.
But it is so much more. The data piece, the data modeling, and we need to have rich ways of modeling the data, especially with AI where you need context and rich data way more than what the existing systems have. Think about commodity codes or material group codes or commodity codes. It's like, it's a field called a commodity code in a supplier master. No, that's not a very rich way of expressing all the attributes around a supply market, right?
Yeah.
So
pick a
even
category
taxonomies
for
themselves.
IBM, right? Are they supplying software
Right, that's right.
or hardware or consulting or, right? Yeah,
that's right.
good luck.
So Absolutely, right. So you need to have a much richer way, not just a taxonomy, but big word ontology, to express, to model the meaning of concepts and data at a much richer level, because ultimately AI is going to demand that, and it already demands that, to give you that the context and all the data you need to actually create, to predict the outputs and, do all the things that you want to do, right? So the data problem is much richer than just bad data quality in limited, fragmented, narrow, deterministic, fixed data SaaS systems. So
It's so important in terms of context, right? We think about what large language models need. They need context and so much of it. And then, yes, they need and want quality data. They can work without perfect data, thank goodness. But the risks that that introduces and the ways that we need to get into how we blend deterministic with agentic or with AI, and that probabilistic meets the deterministic in a variety of different ways. And I know I've seen marketing slides and demos that make it seem like it's all agentic all the time. You'll have legions of auditors. But in a similar session, I painted that picture of those great expectations that executives have that then are translated into the expectations of, 5 people running a legion of 50 agents that are all working diligently and carefully. And then you flash forward 2 months after go live, and it's like somebody let those little yellow minions loose, and there's just stuff getting destroyed because things aren't on rails. They're not well enough controlled, or there's overhype on what the AI could actually do. So the deterministic, I think, is still massively underweighted. I'd love your help to describe more on that.
yeah, I did a whole presentation on this at DPW, which was around kind of, AI doesn't replace SaaS. It needs to work in conjunction with SaaS, right? So this idea of a neural symbolic architecture, well, you don't have to geek out too much on this, but, you have the world of just LLMs and language models, and then you have the whole idea of deterministic, symbolic models. So in the traditional SaaS world, we have concepts, right, around a supplier and a contract and a cost center and an item and, whatever, right, and a risk type. All these things are very structured ideas and concepts, and that's the whole world of symbolic representation. If anybody is like type 1, type 2 thinking with Kahneman and all that, right? We need kind of the language based models, but LLMs are inherently around text, right, and syntax, right, and some level of semantics, but not deep kind of understanding of the concepts. And the concepts are where the structured data lives. So those things need to come together. But let's just take a simple example, right? The concept of guided buying. So this was a term that I coined. I like my one claim to fame, right? Is that I coined this term guided buying back in 2004. And it wasn't a very fancy idea. It was just like, hey, rather than suppliers guiding you through a selling process, why don't you actually, on the procurement side, help everybody that buys in your enterprise give a good, guided buying process that's similarly nice and it's easy and you know what to do, but you're in control of it, right? And so we asked, and so for the casual user, what are you looking for, right? And it's like, well, mouse. All right, well, computer peripheral or a lab animal. Well, depending on where that goes, right, it's going to send you down different paths. But to actually build guided buying requires not only do you understand the goal and the context of what the user is trying to do, right, which is in agentic, right, you need that kind of piece of it, but that all the data underneath, there needs to be a data model, right, around the category, the data elements is for that category, the process channel, the catalogs, the supplier type, all this like rich set of information that needs to be kind of assembled and create the workflows and the user experience and the data that's needed. Like in supplier onboarding is a great example, right? Like all these various permutations, we're going to ask suppliers to only give us what we truly need versus here's your 400 questions you need to fill out, whether you're a truly critical supplier or just someone like me giving you an advisory service and here's some information on my website. I don't need to be SOC 2 friggin' certified, guys, I mean, anyway, not to go down the rat hole on that, right? But anyway, that's an idea of a very simple, straightforward, value-adding process around it, guided buying that, does require a rich set of information to really make that happen. And it's not just an app or a crappy smart form around a specific category requisition form. It's actually much more than that. And that's that ability to build that. And that is a much bigger ask than what has been out there today.
Yeah, it's a little bit more than just a, a free text search, fuzzy text lookup. Otherwise, you'll get all kinds of mice. Pierre, I'm grateful for your time as always, and I know we could talk for hours, but I think I am grateful for your experience and the way that you show up, helping people understand what's real and what's pretend out there in the ecosystem. Thank you, Pierre. Really appreciate you. And for all of you watching, this has been another edition of The Never Ending Climb for a Stronger Supply Chain and Procurement. We'll see you next week. Thanks, Pierre.
Happy to be here. Thanks, John.